right, here is chapter 14 of The People of Sparks. Okay, chapter 14, What Torrin Did. All day after Casper and Maddie left, Mrs. Murdo wondered where Lena was. Had the doctor sent her on an errand? She asked, but the answer was no. Did Torrin know where she was? He said he didn't know and he didn't care. Thinking maybe Lena had gone to the Pioneer Hotel to see Dune, Mrs. Murdo walked down there. But no one had seen her. By evening, when Lena was still missing, Mrs. Murdo was very worried. She found the note in her book that night. She frowned as she read it. This didn't seem like a good idea to her. It was one of Lena's rash, impulsive acts, and probably it was dangerous. Mrs. Murdo went downstairs, knocked on the doctor's door, and showed her the note. "Can we send someone after them?" she said, "to bring her back?" But the doctor shook her head. There are whole days ahead of us. They're a whole day ahead," she said. "No one could catch up, even if you could find someone willing to go." So Mrs. Murdo went back to bed and tried to sleep. She told herself that Lena had survived many dangers before. But still, she lay awake, worrying most of the night. In the morning at breakfast, Torrin asked where Lena was, and Mrs. Murdo told him. He jumped up from his chair. He threw down his piece of bread, which bounced on the table. "She went with them?" he cried. "She went with Casper?" "Calm down," said Dr. Hesper. "No," yelled Torrin. "I won't calm down. I hate her. I hate all you cave people. Why did you have to come here and ruin everything?" With a furious swipe of his hand, he knocked over Mrs. Murdo's cup of tea. He kicked backward at his chair, which fell over, and he ran out of the room. Through the window, Mrs. Murdo saw him racing across the courtyard and out of the gate. "Jealous," said the doctor. "He wants Casper all to himself. Heaven knows why." "That boy craves attention," said Mrs. Murdo. I doubt that he cares who it comes from." "I suppose you're right," said the doctor, looking at Mrs. Murdo with a faint surprise. I wonder what Torrin's going to do. Torrin sped down the river road, full of boiling rage. He was the one who should be sitting beside Casper. Not that fat Maddie and not that stupid cave girl. He should be there riding on the truck going away to be a roamer. But she had snuck off and done it instead, and he hated her for it. It was the worst thing that had happened to him in his whole life. He ran a long way, his feet pounding the dusty road, his fists pumping back and forth, furious tears streaming down his face. When he stopped panting, he was way out in the tomato field, not far from the wind tower, where he had been the day the cave people came over the hill. He remembered how they looked, like a swarm of horrible insects coming down toward the village. Now the cave people had settled in as if they were going to stay forever. They were eating food that should belong to Sparks people. They were wearing clothes that Sparks people had given them. They walked around in the streets of Sparks as if they belonged here. Torrin wanted them gone. He stomped among the tomato plants, throwing punches in the air. "Get out of here! Get out!" he cried, as if Lena and the Emberites were there to hear him. His thoughts were like flames inside his head. He kept seeing Casper on the seat of his truck with Maddie on one side of him and Lena on the other. That feeling that went with this picture was like a sharp stick in his stomach. If only he had one of those giant bombs they had in the old days. He imagined they were about the size of watermelons. He would shoot one at Lena. Pow! It would sail halfway to the city and drop right on Casper's truck and blow them all up. He would shoot another one at the Pioneer Hotel. Blam! It would flatten the building and blow up every one of the cave people. He longed to throw that big bomb. He could almost feel it in his hands. He'd come out at the end of the row of plants now, where a small whitewashed storage shed stood at the edge of the field. Crates of tomatoes were stacked nearby, ready to be distributed. Without thinking, Torn grabbed a tomato from the nearest crate and hurled it against the wall of the shed. It splattered. Red water dripped down the white wall. It felt so good to do this that he did it again. In a fury, he snatched up one tomato after another. Wham! 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 He flung them with all his might until the window of the shed splintered. The wall was a bleeding mess, and a long mound of broken red flesh lay on the ground. He stopped and took a breath. What would the farmers think when they saw this? 2 whole crates of tomatoes smashed? Oh, they'd be angry. But they wouldn't know he had done it, would they? No one had seen him. And that was when an idea floated into Torn's mind. A really excellent idea. He smiled, thinking about it. He threw one last tomato, aiming for the dark, glass-toothed hole of the broken window. There was a satisfying crash as the tomato knocked something over inside. Torn turned and ran, but he didn't go all the way home. Yikes. What do you think he's gonna do now? When Dune came through town that morning on the way to work, he found Mrs. Murdo waiting for him by the side of the road. She signaled to him with one finger, and he left the stream of workers and came over to her. "Lena has gone off," she said. "I thought you should know." Gone off? Gone off where? Mrs. Murdo produced a scrap of paper from the pocket of her shirt. "Read this," she said. Dune read. He scrunched up his nose in puzzlement. He remembered Lena telling him something the other day about these people, Casper and Maddie. What had she said? He tried to recall. He looked again at the note. Something important, she says. What would that be? Mrs. Murdo shrugged her thin shoulders. She gets ideas in her head, she said. Dune could see that she was worried, though she didn't say so. Well, she says she'll be back in 2 or 3 days, said Dune. That's not so long. The odd thing is, said Mrs. Murdo, that Casper, when he left, said he wouldn't be back for several months. Dune frowned. What was Lena up to? He didn't understand it. But he didn't want to make Mrs. Murdo more worried than she was. She must have some plan for getting back, he said, handing back the note. Of course, said Mrs. Murdo briskly. She folded the note and placed it in her pocket. There's no need to worry. I'll have her come and find you as soon as she returns. She headed back toward the doctor's house, and Dune went toward the fields. He walked slowly to give himself time to think. He was upset about Lena. How could she be so foolish as to launch herself out into an unknown world with 2 unknown people? But in a way, he wasn't surprised. Lena was always eager to investigate new places. Look how she'd gone up to the roof of the gathering hall on the first day she'd become a messenger in Ember. Look how eager she'd been to go down into the pipeworks. She probably just wanted to see what was outside of Sparks. As soon as she'd satisfied her curiosity, she'd be back. But Dune was upset about Lena for another reason too, and it didn't have to do with her safety. He was upset that she'd gone exploring without him. All through the last days of Ember, they'd been partners. Now she'd gone off on her own, leaving him here. He was annoyed, and he was hurt. He had to admit to himself that he hadn't been a very good friend to Lena lately. Maybe he'd hurt her feelings by paying so much attention to Tick. But still, it was Lena who was his partner in important things. If she had an urgent reason for hitching a ride with Casper, why hadn't she told him? Why hadn't she asked him to come along? He trudged toward the tomato field, head down, scuffling his shoes irritably in the dust, and so he didn't notice until he was right up to it that a commotion was going on by the storage shed. Everyone was crowded around it, and Chugger, the team leader, was yelling. Dune hurried forward to see what was going on. "Wasted! Wasted!" Chugger was shouting. "2 whole crates smashed! Who's done this? And the shed's plastered with muck, and the window broken?" He glared at the crowd of workers. "Any of you know about this?" he demanded. "Any know what mad person did this?" No one said a word. Dune stared with horror at the mess on the wall. It looked gory, as if it were smashed animals instead of just tomatoes. He could feel the rage of the person who had done it. "I don't like this," Chugger said darkly. "Nothing like this has ever happened before you people arrived. I want it cleaned up right away. Walls washed, window fixed, mess cleared away. Get on it." "Listen," someone said. Dune turned to see. It was Tick speaking. "We didn't do this. Don't get all tough with us." Chugger whipped around. "Who else would do it? Who else but one of you, always griping and grumbling?" "But we only just got here now. How could we have done it?" someone called out. "Besides, we wouldn't," cried someone else. "We would never waste food." More and more voices rose in protest. Dune added his too, saying, "It wasn't us. It couldn't have been." But Chugger just stood and scowled at them. Finally he yelled, "Quiet! Get to work!" Just after that, Dune heard running footsteps behind him and turned to see Torin racing across the field. He was shouting in his shrill, high voice as he saw. I saw!" he cried, waving his arms. "Last night I was out here and I saw!" He ran into the midst of workers and stood panting, his little eyes wild. "I heard a thump, 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 so I snuck up to see, and I did see." "Well then," said Chugger, "what did you see?" "I saw who threw the tomatoes. I saw who made that big mess and broke the window." He stood with his neck poked forward and his skinny arms held tight to his sides. His whole body was trembling with excitement. His eyes scanned the group of workers. "It was him!" he shrieked, pointing straight at Dune. "It was him that did it! I saw him!" Dune was so shocked he couldn't make a sound. He stood with his mouth open, staring at Torin. Around him, a few people spoke up. "He did not," said someone. "He couldn't have, anyway. He wouldn't." "No," someone else said. "He would never do that." But Chugger seized his arm and pulled him roughly aside. "What do you have to say for yourself? Is this your doing?" Dune shook his head. "No," he said. "No, that boy is lying." "And why would he do that? Why would he take the trouble to come out here first thing in the morning to point you and lie?" I don't know," said Dune. Chugger released his arm with a push. "I'll be keeping a special eye on you from now on," he said. "But why? I didn't do this." "How do I know that?" said Chugger. "It's your word against his, and he's one of us." Woo! That is juicy. Wow. This is creating some serious drama. What do you think about this? Did you expect that to happen? Wow. Let's get ready for chapter 15 next. Okay, we're going to move on to chapter 15. And I have a visitor for this one. This is called A Long, Hot Ride. Lena lay very still, or as still as she could, with the jolting of the truck over the rutted road. Her eyes were at the level of space between the two lowest slats of the crate, so she could see out just enough to guess where they were. Along the road by the river first, and then turning to go around the outskirts of the village. Occasionally she heard someone call a greeting to Casper as she heard Casper's voice returning it. Maddie never said anything that Lena could hear. After a while, there were no more voices. The sun beat down on Lena's back and she began to get terribly hot and uncomfortable. She thought it might be safe to sit up now. The sound of the wheels would muffle any sounds she made, and she was far enough toward the back of the truck so that Casper and Maddie wouldn't see her moving. So she unfolded herself. She peered out and saw emptiness, vast stretches of dry, brown gold grass, no people, no houses. It was an enormous space. She had not realized any place could be so big. Sometime in the afternoon, because of the heat and the rocking motion of the truck, and because there was nothing else to do, Lena went to sleep. When she awoke, she could tell right away that it was nearly evening. The air was cooler, and the sun was so low in the sky that she could no longer see it overhead. Its slanting rays came between the slats of her crate. A cramp gripped her stomach. It was partly hunger. She hadn't thought to bring any food with her, but it was mostly fear. They must be close to the city by now. And when they arrived, what would she do? And what would Casper do when he found her? The truck slowed and came to a stop. Lena felt Casper and Maddie jump down. This place looks good enough, said Casper's voice. Near the water, anyhow. Looks all right to me. That was Maddie's voice. I'll take the animals down to the stream, said Casper. Lena heard clanking and slapping sounds as he unbuckled the harnesses, and then the slow thud of hooves as the oxen were led away. What was Maddie doing? Lena heard a few footsteps, some rustling among grasses. Then there was silence. She had to move. Her legs were cramped and she had a pain in her back. Cautiously, she stood up. She stepped onto the first slat of the crate, and then the second, and when she got high enough to look over the top edge, the first thing she saw was Maddie, sitting on the ground a few feet from the end of the truck, leaning against a tree and staring right at her. Well, well, said Maddie, look who's here. Lena just stared. She couldn't move. Maddie heaved herself up from the ground and came over to the truck. She regarded Lena with a look that was half puzzled and half amused. What in the world are you doing here? I want to see the city, said Lena. Don't you know it's a 5-day journey? How do you expect to ride in the crate all that time and not be discovered? 5 days? I thought it was only 1 day. Maddie just shook her head. What are we supposed to do with you now? Or what are we supposed to do with you? I don't know, said Lena. She felt a trembling start up in her stomach. She should never have come. There was a long pause before Maddie spoke up again. Then she said, Listen, it would suit me fine if you came along to the city. If you're sure you want to. I do want to, Lena said, though she wasn't really sure. Good, said Maddie, because it looks like you have no choice. She smiled. It wasn't an unfriendly smile, but there was a quirk in it that seemed to say, what a situation. Stay there then, she said. I'll be back. She stamped away. Lena watched Maddie heading toward a strip of green grasses and low trees that must border the stream. At the edge of this strip, she could see Casper and the oxen. In all directions, the landscape was the same she'd seen that morning. Gently rolling, empty buildings covered with brown gold grass. Here and there stood low, dark green mushroom-shaped trees. 3 of them stood near the truck, their leaves dusty, their trunks thick and gnarled. The sun had gone down behind the hills in the west, and the sky there was scarlet. Through the air, though the air was still warm, Lena shivered. She sat back down in the crate, pulled her knees up to her chest, and wrapped her arms around them. There, hold your knees, okay? Hold your knees like that. Wrapped her arms around them. Somewhere, a bird sang its going to bed song. Then suddenly, there was loud footsteps and Casper's voice coming toward her. And in a moment, Casper's fist thudding the crate. Let's hit the table. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Come out, he said. Lena jumped and stood on the truck looking down at him. Jump down, he said. She jumped down. Casper glared at her. So, he said, a stowaway. What were you trying to do? Cause trouble? That's your idea of fun? No, Lena said. I want to see the city. What for? A look of suspicion passed over Casper's face. "What do you know about the city?" "Nothing," said Lena. She wasn't going to tell Casper about her vision of the city or what the city might be for the people of Ember. I just want to see it." "Well, too bad," said Casper. "Why should I take you there? Why would I want an extra person to feed, a kid to look after? Your ride stops right here. You can go back where you came from." "1 second," said Maddie. "Listen to me before you decide. She could be useful to us." "Don't be ridiculous." Casper whacked his 2 big hands together as if to dismiss the subject.
Wow.
"Yes, she could," said Maddie. "When you're looking for something in a ruined place, you know how it is. Small spaces, sometimes. Tippy rubble where you need to step carefully. A small, light person could go where we couldn't." Casper took a step back and studied Lena, still glowering. Lena tried to look as small and light as she could. "As for food," said Maddie, "she can share mine." "Ridiculous," said Casper again, but he kept his eyes on Lena. She could see he was thinking. "Come on, Casper," Maddie said. "Let's take her. We don't have much choice after all. The only other thing we can do is leave her out here by herself." She turned to Lena. "If we let you come," she said, "you'll have to work for us. You'll have to do what we say." "All right," said Lena, though she wasn't sure it was all right at all. Maybe it would be better to give up seeing the city and try to get back to Sparks from here. But how would she do that? She'd never be able to find her way. And the empty lands frightened her. She didn't want to be alone in such a vast, wild place. "But how will I get back again? Will you take me?" "You should have thought of that when you climbed onto the truck," said Casper. "That's your problem, not ours." He turned to Maddie. "Right, partner?" "Certainly," Maddie said. "Now let's get settled for the night. The first thing we need is some kindling. Lena and I will go gather it." Lena followed her out toward the trees. Once they were in among them, Maddie bent down and spoke to her in a low voice. "Now don't worry. You were foolish to do this, but I won't let harm come to you. And I'll see that you get home again, somehow." She straightened up again. "Now," she said, "gather up some dry twigs and sticks and a few tufts of dry grass." They carried the sticks and grass back to where the truck was parked. There, Maddie scraped out a shallow hole in the ground with the heel of her shoe. In the hole, she set the smallest splinters of wood, arranging them in sort of a square. Over these, she placed some sticks, and on top of those, she added larger branches. She tucked in some handfuls of dried grass at the bottom of the stick building. Until this point, Lena did not understand what she was doing. But when she pulled from under her pocket a little cloth-wrapped package, unwrapped it, and took out a short blue-tipped stick, she knew. She took in a quick breath and stepped backwards. Maddie held up one of the matches and said, "Have you ever seen one of these?" "Yes," said Lena. "You're lucky then," said Maddie. "They're rare." She struck the match across a rock and the blue tip burst into flame. She held it up to the grass and the grass sizzled and flared up. "Come and stand close," she said to Lena. "We need to shield this from the breeze until it gets going." But Lena stayed where she was, staring. The little flame at the heart of the stack of sticks flickered. It reached for the splintered end of a stick, caught it, and set it aflame. The sizzling grew to a hissing and then to a crackling. Flames jumped and jumped higher, and there again was the orange hand stretching upward with its pointed fingers waving, leaning toward her. Lena stumbled backward. She didn't want to be afraid. Casper and Maddie weren't. Casper had come back now and was crouching right beside the fire, feeding it with sticks and grass. But for Lena, it was as if the flames were shrieking a message to her. "Run! Run! Run!" She stood 20 feet away, staring at the fire with a pounding heart. The wind blew a ribbon of smoke at her, and when she breathed it stung the back of her throat. Maddie noticed after a while that she was out there. "Come closer, Lena," she called. "They won't hurt you." But Lena could not get her feet to walk toward that hissing, snapping blaze. It might not hurt Maddie and Casper, but if she were to stand near it, she was sure it would reach out for her with her orange hand, flick its fingers against the end of her hair or the hem of her shirt, and she too would flare up. "I'm all right here," she said. I don't want to be near it." Casper laughed. Maddie lumbered to her feet and came beside Lena. She put an arm around her. "You're shaking," she said. "Well, never mind. You don't have to be by the fire if you don't want to." From a box on the truck, she took what they called traveler's cakes, lumps a little smaller than a fist, made of Lena knew not what, and she and Casper stuck them on the end of long sticks and roasted them over flames. "You have to get fond of these if you're a roamer," Casper said. "They keep well, their best quality. That's their best quality. You need them for those long stretches where there's no other food to be found." These were dry and tasteless, but Lena was hungry, so she didn't mind much. She ate hers standing up, and she licked her fingers when she was through. She wondered where they were going to sleep. There was no room on the truck, so she supposed they would have to lie on the ground. It was quite dark now. A breeze had come up. From somewhere far away, she heard an animal noise. Yip, yip, yip. Then a long wail and an eerie chorus of wails. "What's that?" asked Maddie. "Oh, what's that?" "What's that?" Lena asked Maddie. "Wolves," Maddie said. "Out hunting. They're not very close, don't worry." Lena shivered. The darkness here was so enormous and so full of terrible things. In Ember, except when there was a blackout, people were almost always safe in their beds when darkness came. Lena wasn't used to being outside at night. She thought about Mrs. Murdo, who would be getting into bed in the doctor's attic room right now. Mrs. Murdo would be worried about her. Poppy would be saying, "Where Wina?" Say that. "Where Wina?" No one would imagine that she was out in this great emptiness with nothing between her and the sky. Maddie took some rolled up blankets from the truck and spread them on the ground. She put 2 of them close to the fire. The third she offered to Lena. Put this wherever you'd like to sleep," she said. Lena walked over to take the blanket, and as she did, Casper tossed a huge branch onto the fire. Sparks sprayed up. Some flew sideways, caught by the wind. Lena jumped away, but a few sparks landed on her sock. She stamped her foot frantically, but this only made the sparks burn brighter. The threads of her sock glowed. On her ankle, she felt a pain like a fierce bite. "No!" she cried. "Get off me!" She shook her leg and clawed at her sock with her hand. Panic rose up in her, and she would have taken off running if Maddie had not blocked her path and grabbed her in her strong arms. Once she stopped her, she bent down and put a hand over the burning place in Lena's sock. And when she took her hand away, the glow was out. But the pain was still there. Maddie took off Lena's shoe and sock and poured cold water on the burn, but it didn't help much. All night, Lena huddled on the ground under the thin blanket, gritting her teeth against the pain on her leg and wishing she had never come on this awful journey.
Daddy.
Okay, people, here is your job for chapter 14-15. First of all, you're going to open up that Spark slideshow that was made for you at the beginning. You're going to click New Slide. At the title, you're going to put chapter 14-15. Here's your job. Number 1, 1 sentence or 2. What's happening with Lena? Got some juicy stuff going on. Number 1, what's happening with Lena? Number 2, what's happening with Dune? Same thing, 1 or 2 sentences. Nice and quick. Just a quick main idea, what's going on with each of them. Finally, number 3, write or record a journal entry for Dune or Lena, your choice, at the end of this day. Write it from their perspective. You can write about their fearings, their worries, their frustrations, what they think is going to happen in the future, etc. Journal entry from Dune or Lena's perspective. Number 3 should be a minimum of 1 full detailed paragraph. You may write it on your Spark slide like your journal entry, typing it out, or you could record it as a selfie video journal and add it to the slide. But of course, it has to be added to the slide because that's where I'm going to look for your work. There is your work for chapter 14 and 15.